The pine trees of North Carolina stand silent in the pre-dawn darkness. It is 3:14 in the morning. The air carries the particular stillness that soldiers know well, that weighted quiet between watches when the world seems to hold its breath. On the sprawling grounds of Fort Bragg, a patrol moves through the training area known as Sicily Drop Zone. Their footsteps are measured. Their weapons are secured. These are experienced infantrymen, men who have served in combat zones overseas, men who do not frighten easily. And yet, on this night in late autumn, something causes them to stop. Something ahead of them, just beyond the tree line, is watching. What was reported in the hours that followed has never been adequately explained. The soldiers who filed the incident report remain, to this day, unwilling to speak publicly about what they encountered. But the documentation exists. And their account is not the only one. Fort Bragg, North Carolina. For more than a century, this installation has served as one of the most strategically significant military bases in the United States. It spans over 250 square miles of Carolina pine forest, sandy soil, and rolling terrain. At any given time, more than 50,000 soldiers call this place home. They train here. They deploy from here. Many of them have spent years within its boundaries, cycling through barracks and training ranges, drop zones and motor pools, and some of them have experienced things they cannot explain. This is not a story about ghosts, at least, not in the conventional sense. This is not an investigation seeking to prove or disprove the existence of the supernatural. What follows is something simpler and perhaps more unsettling. These are the documented accounts of United States soldiers, trained observers, disciplined personnel, men and women who have served their country in some of the most demanding circumstances imaginable, describing encounters that defied their understanding. The reports span decades. They come from different units, different training areas, different eras of the base's long history. And yet, certain details repeat themselves with uncomfortable consistency. Tonight, we examine 3 such accounts. The names of some witnesses have been changed or omitted, in accordance with their wishes. The locations, dates, and circumstances have been verified through available documentation, interviews, and cross-reference testimony. What conclusions you draw from these accounts are your own, but the soldiers who experienced them have drawn theirs, and many of them have never set foot on those training grounds again. To understand what has been reported at Fort Bragg, one must first understand the land itself. The installation occupies a vast stretch of the North Carolina sandhills, a region defined by its unique geological and ecological character. The soil here is ancient, remnants of a prehistoric coastline, deposited when the Atlantic Ocean reached far inland millions of years ago. The longleaf pine forests that dominate the landscape are among the oldest ecosystems in North America, home to species found nowhere else on Earth. It is a landscape of contradictions. By day, the training areas are alive with activity. Artillery ranges thunder with live fire. Paratroopers descend from aircraft in carefully choreographed mass tactical jumps. Convoys of armored vehicles move along dirt roads, kicking up clouds of fine sand that hang in the humid air. But by night, Fort Bragg transforms. The pine forests become impenetrable walls of shadow. The drop zones, those vast, cleared areas where soldiers practice airborne operations, take on an emptiness that seems almost deliberate. Sound behaves strangely here. Voices carry farther than they should. Footsteps seem to echo from directions that make no sense. Soldiers stationed at Fort Bragg often speak of this quality, the way the base feels different after dark. Most attribute it to simple atmospheric conditions, to the peculiar acoustics of the pine forests, to the isolation of training areas that lie miles from the nearest barracks or road. But some describe something else, a feeling, the sense that, in certain places and at certain times, they are not alone. Fort Bragg was established in 1918, during the final year of the First World War. Named after Braxton Bragg, a Confederate general of the Civil War, the installation was originally conceived as a field artillery training site. Its remote location and vast acreage made it ideal for the large-scale maneuvers required to prepare American soldiers for combat in Europe. In the decades that followed, the base expanded rapidly. During the Second World War, Fort Bragg served as one of the largest military training centers in the nation. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers passed through its gates, bound for the beaches of Normandy, the forests of the Ardennes, the islands of the Pacific. Many of them never returned. The Cold War brought new missions. Fort Bragg became home to the United States Army Special Operations Command, housing some of the most elite and secretive units in the American military. The Green Berets trained here. So did the psychological operations specialists, the civil affairs soldiers, and the men and women who would eventually form the backbone of American unconventional warfare capability. Through it all, the land remained. The pine forests watched as generations of soldiers came and went. The drop zones absorbed the impact of countless parachute landings. The ranges echoed with the reports of weapons that evolved from bolt-action rifles to fully automatic carbines to precision-guided munitions. And through it all, the stories persisted. The earliest documented accounts of unusual activity at Fort Bragg date to the 1940s. During the height of wartime training, several reports were filed by sentries assigned to guard ammunition storage areas in the remote western sections of the base. The reports describe sounds, footsteps, voices, what one soldier called a dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the ground. Investigations were conducted. No evidence of intrusion was found. The reports were filed, and they were largely forgotten. But they were not isolated. In the decades that followed, similar accounts emerged with surprising regularity. Soldiers reported seeing figures in areas where no personnel were authorized to be. Others described mechanical failures, radios dying without explanation, vehicle engines cutting out in specific locations, compasses spinning wildly in places where no magnetic interference should exist. The Army, as an institution, does not officially acknowledge these reports. There is no central repository of unexplained incidents, no formal investigation process for phenomena that fall outside the boundaries of conventional military concern. But the soldiers remember, and they talk, quietly among themselves, in the way that military personnel have always shared the stories that don't make it into official records. It is from these conversations, and from the documentation that does exist, that the following accounts have been reconstructed. The land that became Fort Bragg carries its own history, one that predates the military by centuries. Before the artillery ranges and the drop zones, before the barracks and the motor pools, this was the territory of the Tuscarora people. For generations, they lived among these pine forests, hunting the deer and wild turkey that still roam the training areas today. The Tuscarora War of the early 18th century, one of the bloodiest conflicts in colonial American history, was fought, in part, on the very ground that soldiers now traverse during night training exercises. Later, during the Civil War, the region saw its share of violence. Confederate and Union forces skirmished in the surrounding counties. Deserters from both armies hid in the dense forests, some of them never to be seen again. By the time the Army arrived in 1918, the land had witnessed more than its share of suffering. Whether that history has any bearing on what soldiers have reported in the decades since is a question that cannot be answered definitively. But the soldiers who have experienced unexplained phenomena often wonder. They wonder what the land remembers, and they wonder what else might be waiting in the darkness beneath the pines. The first account we examine tonight took place in November of 2003. The 82nd Airborne Division, one of the most storied units in the United States Army, had just returned from a deployment to Iraq. The soldiers were in a period of reconstitution, rebuilding their strength and training proficiency after months of combat operations in a hostile environment. For many of them, the return to Fort Bragg represented a chance to decompress. The familiar routines of garrison life, the physical training, the equipment maintenance, the endless inspections, provided a structure that helped them transition from the chaos of war to the relative calm of home. But the training continued. On the night in question, a squad from Bravo Company had been tasked with a routine patrol exercise on Sicily drop zone. The mission was straightforward. Move from Point Alpha to Point Bravo along a designated route, conduct a reconnaissance of a simulated objective, and return to the starting point by 500 hours. The squad consisted of 9 soldiers. Their squad leader was a staff sergeant with 12 years of service and 2 combat deployments. Their team leaders were seasoned non-commissioned officers with their own extensive experience. These were not new soldiers. These were not men prone to imagination or exaggeration. The patrol departed at 22:30 hours. The first 2 hours proceeded without incident. The squad moved through the pine forest in a standard patrol formation, maintaining tactical discipline despite the training nature of the exercise. The night was cool, temperatures in the low 50s, with a slight breeze from the southwest. The moon was in its last quarter, providing minimal illumination beneath the canopy of trees. At approximately 45 hours, the squad reached a clearing near the center of the drop zone. It was here that the first anomaly was observed. The point man, the soldier at the front of the formation, raised his fist, signaling the patrol to halt. He dropped to one knee, weapon oriented toward the tree line approximately 50 meters ahead. The squad leader moved forward to assess the situation. According to subsequent statements, the point man reported seeing movement at the edge of the clearing. Not the movement of an animal. The soldier had spent enough time in the field to recognize deer, wild boar, and the other wildlife common to the area. This was different. The movement was described as deliberate, upright, human in proportion but somehow wrong in its motion. The squad remained in position for several minutes, observing. Nothing further was seen. The squad leader made the decision to continue the patrol. The mission had a timeline and there was no concrete evidence of threat. Perhaps it had been an animal after all. Perhaps the point man's senses, still heightened from months of combat, had misinterpreted shadows in the darkness. The patrol continued. It was 45 minutes later when the incident escalated. The squad had moved approximately 800 meters from the clearing when the radio operator reported a malfunction. His ANPRC 148 radio, a reliable, combat-tested communications system, had ceased functioning. The display showed full battery power. All connections were secure, but no signal could be sent or received. This was unusual but not unprecedented. Radio equipment fails. Batteries die despite indicators. Electronics malfunction. The squad continued without communication. It was then that the soldiers began to hear the sounds. The descriptions in the after-action report are consistent across all 9 witnesses. The sounds began as footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps that seemed to parallel the squad's movement through the trees. The soldiers initially assumed they were hearing echo effects, their own footfalls bouncing off the dense pine trunks that surrounded them. But when the squad halted, the footsteps continued. They came from the left flank, perhaps 30 meters into the tree line. Then they stopped. Silence returned for several seconds. And then the footsteps resumed, this time from the right flank at approximately the same distance. The squad leader ordered his men into a defensive perimeter. For the next 15 minutes, the 9 soldiers remained in position, weapons oriented outward, scanning the darkness for any sign of the source of the sounds. Their night vision devices revealed nothing. No heat signatures. No movement. Only the endless rows of pine trees, their trunks like columns in some ancient and abandoned cathedral. And yet the sounds continued. Footsteps, always footsteps, moving in patterns that seemed deliberately designed to confuse, to disorient, to unsettle. What happened next remains the most difficult element of the account to explain. At approximately 2:15 hours, the footsteps ceased. The silence that followed was described by one soldier as wrong. Not merely quiet, but actively silent, the kind of silence that seemed to press against the ears, to demand attention. And then from somewhere in the darkness ahead came a different sound. It was described variously as a vocalization, a cry, and in one statement, something trying to speak without knowing how. The sound was not human, according to all 9 witnesses, but neither was it recognizable as any animal known to inhabit the North Carolina forests. It lasted approximately 7 seconds. When it ended, the squad leader made the decision to abort the mission. The return movement to Point Alpha took just over an hour. The soldiers maintained tactical discipline throughout, but their pace was notably increased from the outward patrol. No further anomalies were observed. Upon reaching the start point, the squad leader immediately reported to the officer in charge of the training exercise. The radio malfunction was documented. The unusual sounds were noted. But when the squad leader attempted to describe the vocalization, that inhuman cry that had echoed through the pine forest, he found that the words would not come. According to one soldier's statement given years later, "We all heard it, all 9 of us. But when we tried to talk about it afterward, none of us could agree on what it sounded like. It was like our memories of it were different, like we'd each heard something else." The incident was filed under equipment malfunction and unexplained wildlife encounter. No further investigation was conducted, but the soldiers who were there have never forgotten, and in the years that followed, at least 3 of them requested reassignment to different duty stations. 2 others left the Army entirely at the end of their contracts, citing personal reasons. When asked, none of them will return to Sicily drop zone after dark. The Sicily drop zone incident is notable for several reasons. First, the credibility of the witnesses. These were combat-tested soldiers, men who had faced genuine danger in Iraq and maintained their composure under fire. They were not prone to panic. They were not given to fantasy. Second, the consistency of the account. 9 independent statements taken separately describe the same sequence of events with only minor variations, the kind of variations one would expect from genuine witnesses observing the same phenomenon from slightly different positions. And third, the aftermath. One of the soldiers, speaking on condition of anonymity, offered this observation: "We've all seen things in combat, terrible things, things that stay with you, but what happened on Sicily that night? It was different. It wasn't violent, nothing hurt us, but there was something out there, something that shouldn't have been there, and whatever it was, it knew we were there too. It wanted us to know it was watching." The second account takes us from the remote training areas into the heart of Fort Bragg's residential zone. Ardennes Street is one of dozens of similar roads that wind through the base's barracks complexes. The buildings here are typical of military construction, utilitarian structures of brick and concrete, designed for function rather than comfort. They house hundreds of soldiers at any given time, young men and women who sleep in bunk beds, share communal bathrooms, and spend their nights recovering from the physical demands of military service. In 2011, Building 42187 on Ardennes Street became the subject of a series of unusual reports. The building was assigned to a support company of the 18th Airborne Corps. The soldiers stationed there were not infantrymen or special operators. They were clerks, supply specialists, mechanics, and communications technicians. Their work was essential but unremarkable, the administrative backbone that keeps a modern military functioning. They were not, by any standard measure, the type of soldiers one might expect to report paranormal activity. And yet, between March and August of 2011, no fewer than 14 separate incident reports were filed regarding Building 42187. The first reports were easy to dismiss. Soldiers complained of sleep disturbances, vivid dreams, sudden awakenings in the early hours of the morning, the sense of being watched while lying in their bunks. Such complaints are common in military barracks. Sleep disorders are endemic among service members, the result of irregular schedules, physical exhaustion, and the psychological toll of military life. The NCOs in charge of the building documented the complaints and moved on, but then the reports became more specific. In April, a soldier named Private First Class Michael Torres submitted a written statement to his platoon sergeant. Torres was 22 years old, a motor transport operator from El Paso, Texas. He had been in the Army for 18 months and had no history of disciplinary problems or mental health issues. His statement described waking at approximately 300 hours to find a figure standing at the foot of his bunk. Torres initially assumed it was another soldier, perhaps someone returning from a late shift, or a sergeant conducting an unannounced inspection. He started to rise, prepared to identify himself, but the figure did not move. Torres reached for the light switch above his bunk. In the fraction of a second it took for the fluorescent lights to flicker on, the figure was gone. Torres searched the bay. All other soldiers were asleep in their bunks. The latrine was empty. The door to the hallway was closed and secured from the inside. He did not sleep for the remainder of that night. Torres' report might have been dismissed as a dream, a vivid but ultimately meaningless night terror, if not for what followed. Over the next 4 months, 11 other soldiers in Building 421-87 submitted similar statements. The details varied. Some described waking to sounds, footsteps in the hallway outside the bay, doors opening and closing when no one was there. Others reported visual phenomena, shadows that moved independently of any light source, shapes glimpsed in peripheral vision that vanished when viewed directly. But certain elements repeated themselves with troubling consistency. The time. Nearly all incidents occurred between 300 and 400 hours. The location. The majority of reports came from soldiers quartered on the 3rd floor of the building. And the figure. Those who saw it described it as male, of average height, wearing what appeared to be military utilities. The uniform style was described as outdated. Several soldiers specifically mentioned that it resembled the battle dress uniform pattern that had been phased out of service years earlier. The figure was never observed to speak, to move, or to interact with its environment in any way. It simply appeared, and then invariably it vanished. In June of 2011, the company commander ordered an informal investigation. The building was inspected for structural issues, gas leaks, or any environmental factor that might explain the reports. None were found. The medical officer reviewed the personnel files of the soldiers who had submitted statements. No common medications were identified. No history of mental illness or substance abuse was discovered. A chaplain was brought in to speak with the affected soldiers. He offered counseling and prayer, but no explanations. The investigation concluded without findings. It was in August that the most disturbing incident occurred. Specialist Jennifer Ramsey was a 24-year-old human resources specialist assigned to the company headquarters section. She lived on the 3rd floor of Building 421-87 and had been among the soldiers who reported sleep disturbances earlier in the summer. On the night of August 17th, Ramsey was working late in the company office, located on the ground floor of the same building. She was alone, completing administrative tasks that required secure computer access. At approximately 22:30 hours, she heard footsteps in the hallway outside the office. This was not unusual. Soldiers frequently moved through the building at all hours. Ramsey continued her work, paying the sounds no particular attention, but the footsteps stopped directly outside the office door. Ramsey looked up. Through the small window in the door, she could see the hallway beyond. It was empty. She returned to her work, and then she heard the breathing. Ramsey's written statement, submitted the following day, describes what happened next in careful, measured language. I heard what I can only describe as breathing on the other side of the door. Not heavy breathing like someone who had been running, just steady, regular, like someone standing there doing nothing but breathing. I called out asking who was there. The breathing stopped. I walked to the door and opened it. The hallway was empty in both directions. The exit doors at either end were closed. I returned to my desk. I had decided I was imagining things. And then I heard the breathing again. This time it was behind me. Ramsey turned. Nothing was visible. The office was empty except for her desk, her chair, and the computer terminal at which she had been working. But the breathing continued. She described it later. It was right there, right behind me. I could feel the air moving against my neck. I knew if I reached out I would touch something, but there was nothing to see. Ramsey left the building immediately. She did not return until daylight. The incidents at Building 421-87 ceased abruptly in September of 2011. No explanation was ever offered for their beginning or their end. The building remained in use for several more years before being scheduled for renovation as part of a base-wide infrastructure improvement program. During the renovation process, workers discovered an anomaly in the 3rd floor construction. A section of wall in one of the bays had been improperly sealed during the building's original construction. Behind it was a small void, not large enough for a person to occupy, but large enough to be notable. Inside the void, workers found a single item, a set of dog tags, corroded with age, bearing a name and service number that dated to the Vietnam War era. The tags were turned over to the Army's Casualty Affairs Office. Research determined that the soldier to whom they belonged had been killed in action in 1968. His remains had been recovered and returned to his family for burial. How his dog tags came to be sealed inside a wall at Fort Bragg, a building that was not constructed until 1973, has never been explained. The soldier's name has been withheld at the request of his surviving family members. But his service record shows that he had been stationed at Fort Bragg for training before deploying to Vietnam. He had lived in a barracks building that once occupied the very same footprint as Building 42187. Whether there is any connection between this discovery and the incidents reported in 2011 remains unknown. But the soldiers who experienced those incidents believe there is. The Ardennes street incidents raise questions that extend beyond the immediate events themselves. Military barracks are, by their nature, places of intense human experience. Thousands of soldiers pass through them over the decades, young people separated from their families, facing uncertain futures, preparing for the possibility of combat and death. The emotional weight of such places is difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. The soldiers who reported incidents at Building 42187 were not seeking attention. Many of them were reluctant to come forward, fearing ridicule or professional consequences. They reported what they experienced because they felt they had no choice, because the alternative was to carry the weight of those experiences alone. Whether what they encountered was genuine phenomena or shared psychological response remains unknown. But the discovery of those dog tags, that tangible physical artifact from a soldier who died half a world away, suggests that some connections, once formed, are not easily broken. The final account we examine tonight is the most recent, and in many respects, the most disturbing. It took place in February of 2019 on a remote live fire range in the northwestern section of Fort Bragg. The range, designated Range 37, is used for small arms qualification and tactical training. It is surrounded by dense forest and is accessible only by a single unpaved road that winds for nearly 4 miles through uninhabited training areas. At night, Range 37 is one of the most isolated locations on the installation. On the night of February 12th, a platoon from the 3rd Special Forces Group was conducting a night fire qualification exercise. The exercise was routine. Soldiers would engage targets at varying distances using night vision devices and infrared aiming lasers. The platoon consisted of 32 soldiers, divided into 2 firing orders. While one group engaged targets on the range, the other group waited in a designated holding area approximately 300 meters to the rear. The exercise began at 2100 hours. By 2300, the first firing order had completed their qualification and moved to the holding area. The second firing order took their positions on the firing line. It was during this transition that the first anomaly was observed. Staff Sergeant David Kilpatrick was serving as the range safety officer for the exercise. His position was on a small berm overlooking the firing line, allowing him to observe all shooters and their targets simultaneously. At approximately 23:15 hours, Kilpatrick observed movement in the impact area, the zone behind the targets where rounds would land after passing through or missing their intended marks. This was not entirely unusual. Despite the isolation of Range 37, wildlife occasionally wandered into impact areas during pauses in firing. Deer were common. Wild pigs were not unheard of. But what Kilpatrick observed was not wildlife. His statement, provided during the subsequent investigation, describes the encounter. I was scanning the impact area with my NVGs when I saw movement approximately 200 meters downrange. At first I assumed it was an animal, maybe a deer that had wandered in during the break. But then I realized it was standing upright. I called a ceasefire immediately. You don't take chances on a live fire range. If there's any possibility of a person being downrange, you stop shooting. Through my optic, I could see the figure clearly. It was standing just behind the 50-meter target line facing the firing position. It wasn't moving, just standing there. I called for a head count. All 32 soldiers were accounted for. No one was missing. I returned my attention to the impact area. The figure was gone. The exercise was paused while a safety team conducted a sweep of the impact area. The search took 45 minutes. Night vision devices were employed, along with thermal imaging equipment. Every inch of the impact zone was examined. No evidence of human presence was found. No footprints in the soft sand. No disturbed vegetation. No indication that anyone had been standing in the location Kilpatrick had identified. The platoon leader consulted with the range safety officer. The decision was made to resume the exercise. Range time was limited, and the qualification had to be completed before dawn. The exercise resumed. What happened next occurred in full view of 32 soldiers and was captured, partially, on the range's closed-circuit video system. At approximately 45 hours, during the final iteration of the qualification exercise, the range was plunged into darkness. The generator that powered the target system and range lighting failed without warning. Backup power did not engage. The only illumination came from the stars overhead and the infrared lasers still active on the soldiers' weapons. In the sudden darkness, multiple soldiers reported hearing sounds from the tree line to the north of the range. The direction from which access to the range was impossible due to thick vegetation and a drainage ditch that ran parallel to the firing positions. The sounds were described as footsteps, heavy, deliberate, moving through the underbrush with no apparent concern for stealth. And then, according to multiple witnesses, something else. A voice. The voice was not loud. It was not shouting. It was described as speaking conversationally, almost casually, in a language that no one present could identify. Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb, a Special Forces soldier with 2 decades of experience and fluency in Arabic, Pashto, and Russian, stated that the language was unlike any he had ever heard. "It wasn't just that I didn't recognize it," Webb said in his statement. "It's that it didn't sound like language should sound. The rhythm was wrong. The cadence was off. I don't know how to explain it. It was like someone had learned what speech was supposed to be from a description without ever having heard it." The voice continued for approximately 45 seconds. Then it stopped. In the silence that followed, the soldiers reported a new phenomenon. The temperature dropped. Not gradually, as one might expect from a change in weather conditions. The drop was immediate and severe, a sudden plunge of at least 15 degrees according to estimates from those present. And with the cold came something else, a smell. It was described variously as copper, as iron, as the smell of the aid station after a mass casualty event. Several soldiers recognized it immediately. It was the smell of blood. The soldiers maintained their positions. Their training held. Whatever was happening around them, they responded as they had been taught to respond, with discipline, with professionalism, with the controlled aggression that defined special operations personnel. But they were afraid. This is perhaps the most telling element of the account. These were Special Forces soldiers, men who had operated in the most dangerous environments on Earth, who had faced enemies that would have broken lesser men. And yet in their statements they admitted to fear, not panic, not hysteria. "Fear. I've been in firefights," one soldier said. "I've had rockets land close enough to feel the heat, but that night on the range, that was different. That was something I wasn't trained for, something I didn't understand." When power was restored to the range some 20 minutes after the initial failure, the soldiers conducted a second sweep of the surrounding area. Nothing was found. The temperature had returned to normal. The smell had dissipated. The tree line to the north was empty and silent. The generator was examined by maintenance personnel the following day. No fault could be identified. The fuel tank was full. All connections were secure. The equipment simply should not have failed. The closed-circuit video system, which had been recording throughout the exercise, showed a gap of exactly 17 minutes, the duration of the power failure. The recording resumed seamlessly when power was restored, but the intervening period was blank. The incident at Range 37 was documented in an after-action report that was filed through normal channels and subsequently classified. The soldiers present were debriefed individually and instructed not to discuss the incident outside of official channels. Most have honored that instruction, but some in the years since have spoken quietly about what they experienced. Their accounts are consistent: the figure in the impact area, the power failure, the voice from the trees, the cold, the smell. And one detail that was not included in the official report, a detail that only emerged in later conversations among the soldiers themselves. During the 17 minutes of darkness, while the voice spoke its incomprehensible words and the cold pressed in around them, several soldiers reported seeing additional figures at the edge of their peripheral vision. Not one figure, many, standing in the tree line, watching. When the soldiers turned to look directly at them, the figures were never there. But in the corners of their eyes, in the spaces between heartbeats, the soldiers could see them, waiting. What was out there in the darkness that night? The soldiers who experienced it do not know, but they believe, all 32 of them, that something was there, something that observed them, something that spoke to them in a language that human ears were never meant to hear, and they believe that it is still there, waiting. Fort Bragg has stood for more than a century. In that time, it has witnessed the passage of countless soldiers, young men and women who trained within its boundaries, who lived in its barracks, who walked its ranges and drop zones and endless miles of pine forest. Many of them went on to serve in conflicts around the world. Some of them did not return. The stories we have examined tonight are a small fraction of the accounts that exist. They were chosen not because they are the most dramatic or the most frightening, but because they represent the range of experiences that soldiers have reported, experiences that cannot be easily explained or dismissed. What are we to make of such accounts? The skeptic will offer naturalistic explanations: wildlife misidentified in darkness, sleep disorders manifesting as waking hallucinations, equipment failures attributed to mysterious causes when simpler explanations exist. Such explanations are not unreasonable, but they do not satisfy the soldiers who were there. These are men and women who have been trained to observe, to report accurately, to distinguish between genuine threats and false alarms. They have served in combat. They have faced death. They are not easily frightened, and they are not prone to fantasy. And yet, they report these things. Perhaps there are forces at work that we do not yet understand. Perhaps the land itself holds memories that manifest in ways that defy our current understanding of physics and consciousness. Or perhaps these experiences are entirely internal, products of the human mind under stress, artifacts of the unique psychological environment that military service creates. We do not claim to know. What we do know is that the accounts are real. The soldiers who report them are real. And their experiences, whatever their ultimate explanation, deserve to be heard and documented. The land beneath Fort Bragg has witnessed centuries of human activity, conflict, training, sacrifice. If places can hold memories, if the soil can retain echoes of what has occurred upon it, then this land holds more than most. The soldiers who serve there are part of that history now. Their footsteps join the footsteps of those who came before. Their voices add to the chorus of voices that have echoed through those pine forests for generations. And when they report unexplained encounters, when they describe figures in the darkness, voices in the trees, presences that defy explanation, they are continuing a tradition as old as the land itself. They are bearing witness to the unknown. If you have served at Fort Bragg or at any military installation and have experienced something that you cannot explain, we invite you to share your account. Your privacy will be respected. Your story will be treated with the seriousness it deserves. We do not promise answers. We do not claim to understand the nature of what you may have experienced. But we will listen, because these stories matter, not just as curiosities or entertainment, but as records of human experience, as testaments to the things that soldiers see and hear and feel in the course of their service. The email address is in the description below. Until next time, we honor those who serve, and we remember those who did not return. This documentary was produced using primary source materials, witness statements, and historical records. Some names and identifying details have been changed to protect the privacy of individuals who requested anonymity. The accounts presented here represent the experiences as reported by the witnesses. No conclusions regarding the nature or cause of these experiences should be inferred from their inclusion. Fort Bragg continues to serve as one of the most important military installations in the United States. The soldiers who train and serve there carry on a tradition of excellence that spans more than a century. We extend our gratitude to those who shared their experiences for this documentary, and our respect to all who have worn the uniform. Music for this episode was provided by artist name, under Creative Commons license. Full attribution is available in the description. If you found this content valuable, please consider subscribing to our channel and supporting our work through Patreon. Your support allows us to continue producing in-depth documentary content on military history and the unexplained experiences of those who serve. The link is in the description. Thank you for watching.